Some books are difficult to write. Some books are difficult to read. Welcome to another adventure in Guyanese literature. Welcome to another edition of Oral Tradition. I'd like to take this conversation a little further. Some subjects are difficult to write about. Some issues are difficult to write about. Sometimes it's difficult to talk about books and literature. But let's go to a person who has just completed a book. I won't say what type of book it is because we'll go into the book just now. But the book is Coming Back, An Escape from Suicide, and it's by Neaz Subhan. Welcome to the program, Neaz.
Thank you, Pitamba, for having me.
I said earlier, some books are difficult to write. Some subjects are difficult to write about. This is a well-crafted book. From the beginning to the end, it's a well-crafted book. The background and your life story as you go along. So I want to ask you how difficult it was. I said it's well-crafted. Tell me about the writing process. What triggered the writing process?
Therapy. It was never intended to be a book. I never set out to write a book about that topic. I always wanted to write a book, but not about that. But because of what I was going through, and the book is about, as you mentioned, an escape from suicide. But the escape from suicide meant that you wanted to escape. I escaped from suicide, but it was a reason why I probably wanted to commit suicide. So there were many things that were happening that I came to learn was depression, chronic depression. Mm-hmm. And for me, mm-hmm. having hid my whole feelings, what I was going through from everyone, including my family, my wife, and everyone else, at some point, as I say, every road has an end. And at some point, it caught up with me. I couldn't hide it anymore. I tried. I think I lost the energy. I just gave up on everything. Mm-hmm. And to fast forward, I was able to get help. And then I was asked, after various sessions, what are my passions? Or what is my passion? Or what are my passions? I said quite a few. And writing somehow came up in that conversation. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the clinical physiotherapist said, or clinical psychotherapist said, then write my story, just for the sake of putting it down, to get it off my chest, if I would want to do that. Mm-hmm. And I did that over time, reluctantly. And then someone, I looked at it and I was in discussion with someone and they said, Neaz, you know what? Why not turn it into a book? I said, well, why? Mm-hmm. This is my story. This is my personal story. Why would I want to have that on the outside?
Right.
And the person said, you may never know how many people may be feeling how you are feeling, going through what you're going through. And your story could inspire others that you escape from suicide, and it may help them too. And I thought about it, and then I decided now to sit down and make it a professional piece of document. I tried my best. I'm no expert, but and I want to thank you for your kind words in terms of how you described the book.
Well crafted, yeah.
Thank you.
Go on.
And that resulted in what you have in your hands.
There's a school of thought that says truth is stranger than fiction, or fact is stranger than fiction. Going through this book, some people say it's a page turner. But I had to put it down many a times. As someone who was a creative myself, I keep thinking about facts and fiction. Which leads me to the many masks you were wearing while you were in this stage. And you talk about these masks being too heavy to bear. I mean, jovial, working, hard working, well dressed and things like that. But after time, they were too difficult for you to wear. So there are turning points in your life. Let's talk about turning points. Let's talk about turning points. How did you fall into that situation and the turning point away?
The thing is, Petamba, sometimes we are in a situation and we may not necessarily be aware that we are actually in the situation. You know, they say if you're in the eye of the hurricane, you may not necessarily feel the impact of the hurricane, but somehow you know that you're in the eye. And for me, it's difficult to pinpoint a particular reason, you know, that may have led me to the state that I was in. I denied I was in depression. I keep looking at the news. I'm a news buff, and you're hearing all these things about mental illness. And I could not have bring myself to ever accept that I was, one, going through depression, and two, that depression is a form of mental illness. And I argued with a very prominent person who was a doctor. I said, I do not subscribe that everyone who is depressed mean that they're mentally ill. But of course I was ignorant. You know, I had little knowledge of the topic. So I was in denial, and because I was in denial, it made me maybe blinded by what may have led me where I was. I know I was going through some difficulties. We all have our challenges in life.
Yeah. Some of those difficulties that you wrote about is another thing. Sounds mundane, things that we all go through. But then it's how you approach them. Keep going.
Right. So at some point I couldn't, because I did so many things at the same time. We're trying to find, well, what could have gone wrong, you know. So in writing what is now a book, as against what I noted down as a journal, I had to put context to it. For people, to make it interesting, it had to add some kind of context. And I wanted to use my life as an example. Was this something that just happened? That whatever I was going through, was that something that was that happened overnight?
Yeah.
Or were there things that were happening in my life that I was not paying attention to?
Okay.
So I kind of rewind my life. You know, I rewound it, and I went to see where at some point in my life, where there might have been a sign that I would have ignored. And if there was one sign, was there a second one? Was there a third one? And then, as you would have read the book, you would have seen I go on through what I call these roadblocks, these various roadblocks. And sometimes we are very unaware of them. But in me rewinding my life, I realized that this probably was a built up over time. I got over some of them, somewhat, you know, and it's strange in life, as you mentioned just now. There's a time when I wanted to live, but somehow I was surrounded by death. And there was a time when I wanted to die, but life seems more important. So you're even caught in that rock and a hard place. But for me to sit here and say, look, what exactly may have led to me becoming depressed? It would have been a combination of issues, maybe becoming overwhelmed by circumstances. And sometimes you realize, you know, if you're driving your car and your mind is elsewhere, but then the car suddenly stops, and then you realize, you know what, I'm out of gas. I didn't pay attention to that when I should have been paying attention to the needle, because I'm driving at a very, well, I'm driving for a very long time. Maybe I drove too long. Maybe I drove in many directions and never checked on the needle.
You talk about subtle signs. And I keep wondering, how come people close to you could not see what's happening to you?
You mentioned the word mask, and I can tell you this, as I said in other programs, but Amber, for me, the most difficult thing for me that I had to do, the one that weighed the most upon me, and what I found out to be the most deceiving thing in life, in my personal view, is a smile. A simple smile can deceive. And when I realized, I mean, we all have our challenges. So people ask
Yeah.
you routinely, how are you? You good? You know, Pitamba, you know, you're not looking too well today. Something wrong? No, no, I good, I good, I good.
Yeah.
Sometimes you do it routinely.
Uh-huh.
But then when I realized I may be having these challenges, I made a deliberate attempt that I must hide it. I must. And, you know, not to sound vain, but people who know me and are around me would always talk about my sense of humor and my wit. And I used that as a tool. So despite what I was going through, if I was at a meeting, if I was in the presence of people, I tried to find something that was funny that I could have used so nobody could have had any suspicion that I was going through anything. And that was deliberate. There were days when there was no strength to find any sense of humor. But I had to smile. I had to come to work. I had to go on radio. I had to go on television, right? And I had to put that smile on. And nobody knew. Nobody knew. Not my wife, not my family. No one knew. Because Neaz is always a guy who's laughing and smiling and whatever. So he has to be okay. And that is deceiving because there are many people out here, Patamba, out there who are looking at your program right now. And I hope, you know, that they can, in some way, they can get some help. Those who are suffering, those who are smiling right now. Yes, of course, there are people who are smiling because they're naturally happy. But there are some who are smiling simply because they want to appear to be happy. Because we live in a society, unfortunately, that is very small, and there's a lot of taboo that is attached
Yeah.
to this, to mental illness, unfortunately. And I'm hoping that conversations like these can be able to break those taboos.
Before we come off of that, put this situations, mental illness, depression, suicide, put it in the context of Guyana, as you did in the book, because we need context, and in the world's view.
About a few years ago, I was still hosting Guyana Today, so that would have been before 2015. I recall there was so much new, you know, tragic news about people committing suicide. And they appeared in the press. And I remember seeing a story from Al Jazeera. Came in, went into Black Bush Boulder, did a story on suicide and the storage of pesticides and all of that. That was aired on Al Jazeera.
Wow.
And I recall talking about it on Guyana Today.
Uh-huh.
So it meant that the problem was bigger than we thought it was. And then you heard that Guyana became the suicide capital of the world per capita.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So for me, we forgot. So for many people, this was like a new thing. This was a big thing. But then as a little boy growing up, I recall in 1978, over 900 Americans died by suicide, most of them, if not all of them, in Jonestown. You know, considered the largest mass suicide probably in history. So for me, I try to juxtapose my childhood to the present. That then we didn't, even though we heard it was suicide, it was no big deal. We didn't really see that. It wasn't Guyanese we're talking about. I mean, no disrespect to those people, but in the context of what was happening, suicide clearly was not new to Guyana, because unfortunately for many years we were known just for that issue alone, the Jonestown massacre. Well, the Jonestown incident, because it was basically self-inflicted. So for me, it wasn't new. But then when I was talking about the Al Jazeera article and all of that, nowhere in my thoughts was I thinking about Jonestown. It's when I sat down and I said, okay, I need to put this into context.
Right.
Then it all, you know, I went back to my childhood, and as I said, I rewound my life.
Yeah.
And then I remember, oh yes, this did happen. So it's not the first time that suicide would have been a big issue here in Guyana. For me, it should not be an issue, because you'd want people not to commit suicide. You'd want people to get help. And we should not be dismissive of people. We should not take people for granted.